Okay, this week we're going to talk about people. We're going to talk about hiring and getting the right people on your team, training and developing your people, and then how to take care of them. We're going to cover a lot. We're going to talk about recruiting and hiring and what that process should look like, how to onboard your people well, which can really make or break the relationship that they have with you for the long term, training, and that goes along with onboarding, but then ongoing training as well, time tracking, benefits, how to take care of your people and what kind of benefits team members are looking for, setting company policies, what makes sense for you and your company, performance management, how to track performance management, how to make sure that you're developing your people and that you are communicating with your team in areas of improvement. And then culture setting, how to make sure you have the right people on your team and that you're building a culture that you want. And then we'll get into a little bit more of the technical side of the team members and making sure that they get paid. So talking about payroll and payroll taxes and how to make sure that you're managing that well. All right, let's look at your recruiting and your hiring process. This is probably the area where most small companies miss the mark when it comes to building out their team. And the primary reason is that they rush through the process and they are frantic to get someone in. They've probably waited too long to hire someone, and then they rush through the process just so they can get someone in the door and end up making a bad hire. So it's really important that you put a good recruiting and hiring process in place and that you have procedures, you have a standard methodology that you use for hiring team members so that everyone goes through the same process, regardless of the position that you're hiring, regardless of how quickly you need to get someone in the door. Make sure that you're following those steps for every single hire. The first thing that I recommend is that you want to get clear about what you're looking for. So you want to make sure you set a clear job description with the expectations for the responsibilities in the job, the outcomes that you are going to expect for a person in that role to achieve. And make sure that that's very clear in your job descriptions when you're setting out your job postings. This also plays into something that we'll call a scorecard that we're going to recommend that you implement. And a scorecard is essentially just that. It's a scorecard for the position and for the role. And it will set out all of the expectations for the position, the high-level expectations that you're expecting out of the role. And you will use that as you are going through the performance management process. So it's important to share that scorecard with potential team members up front so that you're able to set those clear expectations of what's going to be expected of them in the job. We'll have a template that we will go over with that scorecard and how you set that. But the general premise behind it is that you want to set, specific outcomes that are easily attainable, but also it's easy to measure. So you want to make sure that if you've got someone coming into a sales and marketing position, for example, and if that person is going to be responsible for your social media, then you don't want to set, the expectation that you will handle our social media. You want to instead set the outcomes that say, hey, you will grow our social media by 20% annually, or you will increase our following by 10 new followers per week. You'll want to set very clear black and white outcomes that you're looking for because it's easily measurable and that's something that you can actually track performance to. So when you're developing these scorecards, I would recommend you develop your scorecard and then you write your job description from that scorecard so that you can post clear job descriptions and people know what they're applying to when they're looking at your positions. And then you want to develop your interview process. And the interview process that you follow can be unique to you. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no one way to do it. But I do recommend that you have more than one interview throughout the process. So typically an interview process, you're going to start with an application. So you are going to have, potential candidates apply to the job. I recommend that when you are doing this, that you set specific screening questions that you want each candidate to answer. And this just helps you, one, to screen out candidates that aren't willing to put forth the effort to answer those questions. And two, it just helps to give you just a quick, it's almost your first interview. It's a quick way to ask questions that you want to get, hey, why are you looking for a new job? What makes you interested in our company? It just helps you to get some general information and kind of see if they're going to be a fit. It's kind of a first test of that. So I recommend that through the application process, you have at least 3 to 5 screening questions that you want to ask them. One of my primary questions I like to ask is what compensation level they're looking for, because I want to make sure that we are setting expectations up front with that. And if you have a position that you are expecting to pay $50,000 a year for, and someone applies and they're looking for $150,000 a year, then they're not going to be a fit. And so that you don't have to waste your time taking them through the process. You can let them know, hey, great to hear from you. I'm glad that you applied to our job, but this isn't going to be a fit because we're too far apart on our compensation requirements. So I highly recommend your application process has at least 3 to 5 screening questions as you're going through that. Then you want to determine how many interviews you're going to do and who you're going to have interview. So depending on the position is likely going to depend on who might be involved in that interview process. It's often important to have the person who is going to be managing or leading that person interview them, but they don't necessarily have to be the person that interviews them first. I like the idea of having the same person, whether it's your HR person, maybe you as the owner, the same person doing that first initial interview, because then you have consistency from a culture fit standpoint. You have consistent, screening for that initial screening. So it can be a very quick initial screening when you do that first interview, 15 to 30 minutes. You can do that. You don't have to do that in person. You can do that on a video call. But it's a quick, it's a quick pulse test. You can determine, hey, do we think that they could be a good fit? You don't have to go into details of all of their experience. You don't have to, talk about every single job that they've had. You're just trying to get a good fit. You're trying to get a good feeling for whether or not they fit with your organization and whether they have the basic level of experience that you need for that role. Then you might say after they do the first interview, then maybe they are going to come in for an in-person interview, or maybe you have another virtual interview with a different person that's going to be a part of that process. You likely will have them at some point meet with your HR person or interview with someone that's maybe at a higher level. So just make sure that you're thinking through what that process works best for you. I highly recommend you do at least 2 interviews. It's the best way to make sure that you're not getting a different person on a different day. It's very easy to prepare for interviews, but it's the longer you spend with someone, the harder it is for people to be not their true, genuine self. So I highly recommend that you do at least 2 interviews and that you get more than one person involved in the process. I personally, I've owned a company for 16 years and I still am part of the interview process for every single hire that we have. I think that's important to me in making sure that I feel like I can do that initial pulse test of making sure they're a good fit with the organization. So think through who it is that makes the most sense and determine what that schedule is going to look like for the interview process. You might want to consider putting some assessments in place for your interviews. Assessments, there are behavioral type assessments that you can use, Myers-Briggs, Predictive Index, DISC, things of that nature that you can use throughout the process. Some of these are okay to use during the interview process to base hiring decisions off of. Some are not. So you're going to want to look into those to determine what makes the most sense for the organization. You can also put technical assessments in place. So if you are hiring for a technical job, one of the companies that I run is an outsourced accounting department back office. So our technical skills required is accounting skills. And so we have a technical assessment that we have our team members complete or potential team members complete through the interview process, just so we can gauge where they're at from their accounting knowledge and the skills that we are looking for. We hire every level of position, so it doesn't mean that just because they score poorly on the assessment that they aren't going to fit within the organization. It just helps us to know where they might fit and what position is good. You may also give certain scenarios or examples of work to them. So If we're hiring an HR candidate, for example, our assessment looks a little bit different, and we give them a couple of HR scenarios that we want them to tell us, hey, how would you handle this? That just helps us to see how they're going to approach the work, and really the effort that they put into it as they're going through that process. And then culture fit. Culture fit is hugely important when you are building out your team. So this is where it's really important to get more people involved in the interview process. I like to have candidates meet with people not even more of an informal basis. So that's not even really through an interview, but it's really, we have candidates sit and have lunch with a few team members just to get a good feel for, hey, are they going to fit within the organization? Do they feel like they're going to fit, as well as do we feel like they're going to fit with the organization? And just making sure that you're very clear on what your culture is. Part of your interview process should include talking about your core values, talking about what your company stands for, why you exist, what you're here for. So it's really important to be upfront about that through the interview process, because a lot of people will kind of really focus on that in the onboarding process once somebody comes on board, but then you've already hired them. So make sure that they are going to fit within your organization and your culture before you even hire them. And it's really important to touch on that throughout the interview process. And then finally, the last thing I'll talk about on recruiting and hiring is your applicant tracking system. It's really helpful if you can put some sort of applicant tracking system in place. There are lots of tools out there that you can use for this. Some of them are expensive or more expensive than others. So you may want to start off with a simple Excel spreadsheet that you're using for applicant tracking. A lot of the job boards will have some sort of applicant tracking you can use as part of posting to their job board. So that's an option for you too. But you want to have some way to know kind of where you're at in the process with your candidates, especially if you're hiring a lot of people and if you're hiring a lot of the same types of people. It's really helpful to have that dashboard. So if you hear about an ATS or an applicant tracking system, that's essentially a tool that you can use where your applicants will flow through from your website or your careers page or job boards. They'll flow through the applicant tracking system. And you can set up stages in there that state, hey, this is a new applicant. This person's in the initial video interview stage. This person's in the second interview stage. This person has an offer out, or this person's at the assessment stage. You can see where everyone's at in the process, and you know how to follow up and when to follow up with those candidates. So it just helps you keep you organized on there. So recruiting and hiring, super important with making sure you're building out the right team. You're getting the right people on your bus, and they're getting developed into the right team members long term. All right, we're going to shift now to the onboarding process. The onboarding process is the process of bringing a new team member on board and getting them acclimated into their new role and onto their new team. And I want to note that the onboarding process starts the second that you've made the offer of employment to a new team member. A lot of companies will wait, and they wait until the first day of hire, and that's when they will start onboarding their new team members. And what I will recommend is that you understand that experience for your new person coming on your team, that experience starts the day you offer them the job. And you want to make sure that your onboarding process is starting there. So when you are thinking of this pre-onboarding phase where they haven't actually walked in the door yet, but you have given them the offer of employment, you want to make sure you have continuous communication with them throughout that process. You send them the offer, and typically, you're offering them a job and they may not start for 2 or 3 weeks. And you don't want to send them the offer and then you have zero communication with them until the day that they show up on the first day. You want to make sure that you are communicating with them on expectations of when should you arrive on the first day and what's the dress code look like. And it's helpful if you can have them start working on paperwork prior to their first day. You can have them get some of that onboarding paperwork done. Most recruiting systems or your payroll system, HR system, which we'll talk about in a little bit, most of those systems will have the ability for you to send them out electronic onboarding documents, and they can get started on that. It kind of helps them feel like they are starting their job early, that they are getting acclimated with the new team, just because they're being involved with they're interacting with your technology and with your people, your HR team, or whoever might be helping with that. So make sure that you are continuously communicating with them. And, if you happen to have, we've had situations over the years where we hire someone and they're maybe starting right after the first of the year, but we have a holiday party in between when we've offered them the job and when they're starting. And we'll invite them to that holiday party. We'll say, hey, you should come and join us so that you can meet some of your team members before your first day. That is a way to start making them feel welcome and feel a part of the team even before they've started. And then streamline the paperwork. I mentioned that I think depending on your HR system or your payroll system that you're using, you can typically make that process pretty seamless for them. And you can make it seamless for yourself as well if you can start that process before they are actually starting. We've had people also reach out and ask, hey, is there anything I can look into before I start, or is there any training I can do? And so if you can have a list of resources, if you have some pretty standard training that you're going to have them do, or standard positions that you hire for, if you can have some sort of resources put together where if someone asks for that, then you can provide that to them. You don't necessarily want to be asking them to do work before they're starting on their first day, but a lot of team members are eager to get started, and they would love to have resources. Are there any books that you have your new team members read? Are there any trainings that I'm going to be doing? If they're going to be, there's a new technology maybe they're using when they start the new role, they may want to get a head start on that and make sure that they kind of feel comfortable with that before they start. First day then is very important. First week is really important. So, don't miss this time to really welcome a new team member and make them feel a part of your team. You want to make sure that you are ready for them on day one. That is super critical. Make sure that their computer is there. Make sure they have a desk. Make sure you know where they're going to be. Depending on the position that you're hiring them for, you want to make sure that they don't walk in on day one and you're trying to get them set up and you're trying to figure out where they're going to sit. You want to make them feel welcome when they walk in the door and that you were expecting them. So make sure that they're fully set up with whatever that entails for the role that they're in and for your company. Celebrate them, give them company swag when they start on day one. Introduce them around the office. Make sure everybody knows, hey, it's their first day. This is great. Bring in donuts for the team. Do something to celebrate new team members as they come in. If you're a rapidly growing company and you're hiring a lot of people at once, make that part of that first week is if you have 5 people starting on the same day, have a welcome lunch for everyone, or have something where you are celebrating them as a full team. If you rarely hire team members, if you're a smaller company and you're not hiring a lot of team members at once, then it can be a whole company event. You can have a get together in that first day or maybe sometime that first week for that. So make them feel welcome, do whatever you can to celebrate them and make them feel like they're a part of the team. Swag's always a good thing. I mentioned that. So if you've got company swag, that's great. It really helps people feel like on day one that they're a part of this. And typically we'll see our new team members wearing swag the very next day that we've given them on day one. So something to think about as you're hiring new people. And then make sure you spend a lot of time with your team members, those new team members, in that first week. You want to make sure, don't just have them come in the door, get them set up at their computer, go through their paperwork, and then give them a list of things and say, hey, go do all this for this week, or go do all this training. Spend a lot of one-on-one time with them, whether it's your HR team spending time with them, whether it's the manager of this position, or just other people. It doesn't have to be the same person spending time with them, but just make sure you've got a lot of specific time set aside to sit with them. And even if it's, a lot of training that they're doing independently, then make sure that you're doing a lunch with them one of those days so you're kind of catching up and seeing where you're at. New hire training. New hire training is critical to, one, helping a team member feel like they can be successful in the role. We hear this all the time when we hire new people, that they're shocked at how much training that we provide to them, and that how much there's a process with the training and there's a schedule, because it's just not very common. So make sure, set yourself apart as an employer and make sure you have a really good laid out training process. You've got a schedule. schedule, you've got a plan, and that you're not just throwing them into the wolves and having them figure it out. So make sure they have a formal schedule, make time for them. Again, you might have a training person that's going to spend a lot of time with them. So if that's the case and you've got someone training them that's not necessarily their manager or their team that they're going to work with, then make sure that there's set aside time for the manager to check in with them. If they're going to be training with lots of different people, maybe give them a go-to like a buddy system or something like that, where they have someone that they can just go ask kind of the dumb questions like, hey, where do I find the coffee, or how do I do this, so that they feel comfortable with that. But make sure that that training program for new hires is very formalized and it's got a schedule and you have a plan, knowing that obviously we're all running small businesses and we know that things don't go according to plan hardly ever. So know that there's going to be times where you might have to disrupt that training schedule because something takes precedent or something is more important. That's okay. And you can be clear with them up front. Hey, this is our plan. This is our typical training schedule. However, because we've had XYZ happen in the last couple of weeks, we're going to have to spend some more time during your training on specifically this one project because we really need to get that going, but then we'll make sure to circle back to this other training. So just make sure that you are very clear with them up front, but the more you can have a formalized training process in place for new hires, the better off that you'll be when you bring on a new hire and have to make those adjustments and adaptations throughout. So shifting on our training discussion past new hire training, you need to be focused on training for all your team members. And I think this is where, companies that do a lot of really good onboarding training, this may be then where they falter, where they hire new people and they train them very well up front, and then they just expect that everyone knows their job and they move on, and they're not intentional about training moving forward. This is really where you can set your company apart for long-term career development for your team, and then also where you set yourself apart for the services that you're providing to your customers, because they can see that your team is constantly evolving and changing and getting better, and they value that, and they can see that in the services that they're providing. So training is really important as a part of your people management. You want to make someone accountable for training. It may not be someone's full-time job, especially in a small company. That's not going to make sense. But you want to make sure that someone is accountable for training. Someone is accountable to make sure that every month you have some sort of training scheduled, or you have like a refresher training for new hires 6 months after they've started. You have annual, week-long trainings, or you have programs that you put in place where you're bringing your team all together to do training a couple of times a year. You want to have someone accountable for making sure that your training is intentional and that you have set out a schedule, set out a program, and put something in place for that. So make that someone's job where that is their responsibility to make sure you're doing that. Formalize your training schedules. So again, making sure if someone's accountable to it, it's going to hopefully ensure that it gets done. But formalize the schedule so that you're not just saying, oh yeah, we should probably do some training. We haven't done anything in a while. Know that, hey, at least once a month, we're doing a lunch and learn, for example. Make sure that you are adding a regular training schedule in for specific times throughout the year. So if you've got, for example, a seasonal business, and as you get ready to ramp up for the year, you want to bring everybody in and talk about any new systems that you put in place, any new equipment that you've gotten, then you should set aside that time to know that, okay, every March we're going to have a 2-day training session as we ramp up for our new season. So depending on your business is going to depend what makes sense for you. You might want to set up quarterly workshops where you've got more dedicated time for training. So it's hard to disrupt the day-to-day work, and so it's those lunch and learns are really good for short, quick snippets if you're trying to get an hour-long training in, but you might have something where you want to really focus on an area, and so quarterly workshops might be a good idea for you. You might want to consider an annual offsite training. So a lot of companies will do kind of sales kickoff meetings, or they'll do annual trainings once a year where they take everyone off site to, for 3, 4, 5 days, and they really focus and hone in on a lot of aspects of the business. And they're trying to really better the company as a whole, but get everyone the training that they need that's going to help them do their job better. So things that you can consider, depending on your size and depending on what you do and what your team members are responsible for, that's going to play into what you are going to be able to do for training. And you may not be able to shut down the office for a week for everybody to go, so maybe you've got to take groups at a time to go do different training, or you've got to schedule it strategically so that it's done during a time during your off season or when things aren't going to disrupt the services you're providing. Set a training for budget, set a budget for training. Set money aside for each team member. Set a budget for the year. You can set it as just a total training budget. You can set it as a per person training budget. But make sure you invest in training. Make sure that your team can see you are intentional about that and that you really are encouraging your team to continue to further develop their skills. That budget can be small depending on the size of your company and what you can support. And then as you grow, you can continue to grow in what you're able to offer and what you can, build into that. But make sure, again, this is being intentional about it. If I set a budget for it, then I know that we are planning for that training and we are going to invest in that. And then I recommend using internal resources for training as well as external. It's really, it just seems to help it's refreshing, I guess, or it just seems to help, validate the training when you can bring additional resources in. If you are constantly doing your training, you're the owner of the company and you've got a relatively small company and you lead every training, that's great. You know your business, you know the industry, you know the work, and that's awesome. But it's just refreshing for your team to see a different perspective. It's maybe it validates it more when they hear what you've been telling them from someone else's mouth. So use external and internal resources. Internal resources are going to be great because one, they're going to be specific to how you want your team to do things and what you want them to know. And it's also less expensive because you've already got the resource. But make sure that you're also setting aside, time and money for some of those external resources, whether it's going to a conference, whether it's sending team members to offsite training, or bringing in resources that can provide that training for you. All right, let's shift to taking care of your team. So, it's really, it's important that you get them onboarded, get new team members onboarded well, that you show them that you care about them, you welcome them to the team, and then you're constantly developing them through your training programs, and you show that you're investing in them and their career. But where the employees in the team are going to feel it impact them the most from a financial perspective is your benefits package. And, as a small company, you can't always offer everything that larger companies can, but it is becoming more and more important that you have at least a basic level of benefits that you can offer. Because so many team members are going to look at the benefits package even more so than they might look at the salary by itself. They are going to consider what that looks like for them to switch jobs or to come, join your team, because they need to make sure that they have at least that basic level of coverage that they need to take care of themselves and their families. Various benefits packages you might consider putting in place. Health, dental, and vision. So this is kind of the first tier of benefits I would recommend that you look at, is being able to offer a health plan for your employees, dental and vision. Typically, with a group health plan that you're going to provide, you as the employer will have to cover at least 50% of the cost for the employee. That's the group policy that will be set by the provider that they're giving it to you. So they won't let you put a group plan in place if you're not going to cover at least 50% of the employee's coverage. That does not mean you have to cover 50% of their spouse and their family, their kids and everyone else, but you have to typically cover 50% of the employees. This may not be the case for every plan that you find, so something to talk to your broker about as you look at it, but just something to keep in mind as you are looking at benefits to implement. Dental and vision then typically just come along with your health plan, and that could be something that you either cover on behalf of the employee or that you just offer as a group benefit, but that they cover the cost for that. PTO, paid time off is one of the easiest benefits to provide because it doesn't really cost you additional money. In most positions and in most roles that someone is working in, it's not necessarily costing you additional money. It's really just something that you are having to do without them being there in their position for that day, but you would have paid them anyway. So PTO is really a good benefit that you can start with, and it's something that can be relatively low cost for you, especially in certain types of industries. Obviously, if you have employees that you have to have them there producing so that you can generate revenue, that becomes a little bit more costly to you to provide PTO. So you just want to weigh the cost benefit as you are doing that. PTO, again, is becoming more of a guarantee at most positions. So if you are not offering paid time off, it's likely you're going to have a hard time competing with your competitors as far as hiring those team members. There are different types of paid time off policies. Some companies will give a certain number of weeks. They'll give it at the beginning of the year. Some companies will say you accrue a certain amount of hours every pay period or every so many hours that you work. Others will have, an unlimited PTO policy where they aren't necessarily setting a limit to what you can take, but they just have other parameters and expectations of the job performance and the job being completed to be able to do that. So think about what makes the most sense for your company. The thing that I can recommend the most on PTO is that you set up something that is not complex. We've seen a lot of PTO policies over the years that it feels like you need a PhD to be able to explain it to someone. So make it simple. Accrue the time as they work, give them a certain number of hours at the beginning of the year, or give the flexible unlimited, but make it simple so that it's easy for them to understand, and that it's also easy to manage and easy to track for you on the employer side. Short-term, long-term disability, life insurance. These are some pretty low-cost benefits often that you can offer as an employer. Short-term disability can cover maternity leave. So that's something that you can look to implement if you want to have a way to offer maternity leave, but to subsidize it, the cost for that. Long-term disability obviously is important. It's super inexpensive, but it's really a great benefit to provide in case one of your team members were to get injured and be unable to work for the long term. And then life insurance, that's again a very low cost benefit that you can add that can provide just an extra level of support for your team. Flexible spending accounts, dependent care accounts. So these are benefits where you're allowing your team to take money pre-tax out of their paycheck and put it set aside into a medical spending account or a dependent care spending account. These are a little bit less common in a small business just because there is some cost to maintain those and to administer those. And if you don't have very many people on your team, it's likely you're not going to have that many people participate. So the cost benefit doesn't make sense. But if it is something that you feel like you want to offer, it does give another benefit that you can add for your team that is relatively low cost for you. It just does have a cost for it so that you want to make sure it makes sense to implement. Retirement plans, 401k, simple IRA. These are really important for you to offer as an employer because it's really an investment in taking care of your team for the long term. This is likely not something you're going to offer your employees when you first start out because it is, health benefits are typically going to take precedence over a 401k because there are other ways for them to, invest and save for retirement, but there's not typically easy ways for them to get health benefits. However, it is something that you really should consider if you can cover the cost of it. It is something that I would recommend you consider offering to your employees. A simple IRA can be relatively inexpensive for the employer to implement and does offer similar benefits to a 401k. So that may be a way to get your feet in the door with a retirement plan without going all the way to a 401k. That can be a little bit more costly for you. However, if you think you're going to grow significantly and have a pretty large team, you may want to just start with implementing a 401k plan because the cost may be not that much different for you, and then you just have something in place for the long term. 401k plans are often easier for team members to understand than a simple IRA because they're more common practice, but they're definitely both good options, and you can implement either one of those, and that's providing a long-term benefit for your team for that retirement savings. So get with your investment advisor and discuss what some options are for you on that. Tuition reimbursement is another one you might consider. This can be something that's added on to your training budget that we talked about that you were giving, but if you've got a workforce that might be going back to finished degrees, or maybe there's a benefit to you for them to pursue higher level degrees, then this might be something you want to consider as offering tuition reimbursement so they can use that for their schooling. And then some others that you may consider and that may make sense depending on where your business is located and the type of demographics that you hire. You might want to offer gym memberships. If you are located in an urban area and you happen to be, your office is above a gym, it might be, really beneficial for your team if you can offer them a discounted membership to that gym. It's right there, it's convenient, and it's something that you can partner with the gym and likely get a discount to be able to do that. If you are, out in the suburbs, you're not close to any gym at your office, and all of your team members drive in from all over the place, it might not make sense to offer a gym membership because there's not an easy way to, have one that works for everyone and that's convenient. So something to think about. Food delivery service, that's something that I've seen more companies do, is maybe they offer their team a membership for one of the food delivery services so that they get free delivery when they're ordering their Grubhub or their Uber Eats or whatever that happens to be. So that's something you can consider. One of the things we've done for our team for years is an Audible subscription is a benefit that we provide. We do a book a month club at work, and so it gives everyone a way to listen to the book that we select for free, but then it also gives them their subscription so that they have it for the long term too. So there's lots of different things you can consider. There's lots of low cost options to offer benefits for your team, and then obviously there are more benefits you can add for more costs. So just something you need to think about and weigh, the cost of the benefits that you're going to be providing with the benefit that your team is receiving for those and what makes the most sense for you. But it's really important to take care of your team and to think about your benefits package as you're developing that with who your team is, what they value, and what you can sustain and what makes sense for your business. All right, so now we're going to start talking a little bit more about the practical applications and tools that you're going to use in your business for managing your team. So first I want to talk about time tracking, why you track time. The first reason you track time, obviously, is so you can pay accurately. So if you have team members that are being paid an hourly wage and that you are paying them for every hour that they work, then you're going to need to make sure you have accurate time tracking for that. You may also want to make sure you have time tracking for job costing purposes. So if you're in a business where you are paying hourly or salary, whichever way you're paying, but you are working on specific jobs or specific clients or specific projects, you may want to make sure that your team is not only tracking the hours that they work, but they're tracking the hours that they work to those specific projects. And that way, when it is time to pay them, you can take, if you have to pay someone 40 hours for this week, then you can allocate 10 of those hours to job 1, 20 of those hours to job 2, and then 10 of those hours to job 3. And you have a way to break that out because that's how they tracked their time. So regardless of whether you're paying people hourly or not, if you've got a salaried employee, then you are going to just take their salary and divide it on a pro rata share based on the hours that they work to each of those projects. So job costing is very important. We talked about that in the accounting section. Job costing is really important for you to determine if you're charging enough for the work that you're providing. And your labor is one of the largest components components to your job costing typically. So you want to make sure that you have a method for tracking that time to those jobs, and then you can allocate the cost there. And then utilization. If you're in a business where you are paying a salary, you're paying a salary to your team members, but you need them to be billable to a certain extent for it to make sense, then you want to track their utilization. How much time is your team spending on administrative tasks versus actual client customer billable work? So you want to know that you need administrative time for your team, right? You want them to be doing training. You know that they're going to be checking in with emails and that they've got administrative tasks they have to do, but you're going to want to set some sort of target for utilization so that you know that, hey, we want to make sure that you're spending at least 80% of your time on client billable work and 20% of your time is admin, or maybe it's 70%, whatever works, whatever makes sense for the industry you're in or for the types of services that you're providing. Systems and tools to track your time. I recommend that you set up some sort of a timekeeping app versus paper timesheets or a spreadsheet or something like that. But obviously start where you are. So if the bare minimum is you're going to want to have at least a paper timesheet where you can track each project that they work on and the hours that they've worked on that project. But it's relatively inexpensive and also relatively easy to implement a basic timekeeping system that will track by job. So I highly recommend that you look at those tools because it will make your life easier. Some of those timesheet systems or time tracking apps will integrate with your accounting system so that if you are setting up a project in your accounting system, it will automatically set that up in your timekeeping system, and vice versa. If you set it up in your timekeeping system, it'll pull over to your accounting system. So it can help streamline that tracking as well for you. Your payroll system may also do time tracking for you, so you might want to consider that. If you have a payroll system that you're using, they may have a time and attendance app that goes along with that. So that's a way that you can do it that just streamlines it for everyone. So they have the same login for timekeeping as they do for payroll. It just makes it easier for them. So whatever you do, at least start with something. So if it's starting with a paper timesheet or an Excel timesheet, do that. But consider looking into timekeeping apps that will help streamline not only the timekeeping piece of it, but also your accounting and other record keeping, because it's going to work across your various systems. All right, so let's talk about policies. As a company with employees, you're going to need to implement some policies, and it's just a necessary requirement as you hire team members that you are going to need to set expectations and set company policies that outline those expectations. However, I would recommend as a small company that you are careful not to get too policy heavy. We've had, companies come to us and they've got 5 employees and they give us their employee handbook and it's 100 pages long. And it just doesn't make sense for a company with 5 employees to have a 100-page handbook, right? There are various requirements that as an employer that you do have to have policies around. Most of those requirements start to come into play as you get larger. As you get 15 employees, you might have to implement a few more policies. As you get 50, you might have to implement a few more. But if you are, a company that is relatively small and you have very few employees, think about those policies that are going to have high impact for the company. They impact a certain, if you are in a business where your team has to be there on time to service customers, they've got to open the door so that customers can be there, you're going to want to put a policy in place for late arrival. That is going to be something that is going to impact the service of your business. If somebody shows up late and they didn't get the door open and I come to go shopping and I can't get into the store because no one is there, that's high impact. So you're going to want to set a policy for late arrival. You're going to want to set a policy for attendance. You're going to want to set maybe a call-in policy that says, hey, if you call in so many times over a period of, a month or 2 months, whatever that looks like, you're going to have disciplinary action. You're going to want to set policies for that. For an office that has a relatively flexible schedule and you're not dependent on who's there when, and your customers aren't coming to your door, that may not be as important of a policy for you to implement. You may instead implement policies of delivery, customer delivery or performance. So think about those policies that you want to implement and that are going to have high impact. If you've got an office that doesn't ever really see outside clients or vendors or anyone that you're really not ever seeing anyone at your office, your dress code policy might not be as important as someone who has a retail presence where people are coming into the store and they see their appearance every day. So think about those things when you're setting your policies and determining what policies to set. Communicate clearly and often. I find that you can set policies and you go over those policies when you hire someone, and people forget policies. People forget that they're there. So communicate them clearly and often. Communicate them. Maybe if you have weekly team meetings, just cover a new policy, not a new policy, but cover a policy every single week, just to remind everyone. They say you have to tell people things 7 times before they remember. I think it's more than 7, and I definitely think it's more than 7 over a long period of time. So if you've told people 7 times, but it's been a year since you've told them, they've probably forgotten. So make sure you're communicating and you are clear with what the policy is, but then you're reminding often what that policy is. Review your policies annually and update as needed. So I recommend that you're reviewing your handbook or your policies every year to determine, do they still make sense for you? Do they, have you changed anything in the business that you need to implement a new policy, or you need to get rid of a policy because it no longer applies. So review them every year. And then I recommend that you're working with either an HR professional or your attorney on those updates as you are working through them, just to make sure that if there's anything new that has come about in the last year that might affect policies that you should implement, they can help communicate that with you and make sure you get those in place. And then make sure all your policies are available to your team members. This may seem simple, but a lot of times you put your policies together and they're in your HR folders or wherever you're saving that, and then you haven't actually made them available to your team. So you may have given them a copy at the beginning, printed copy when they started, but just make sure that there's a place where they can go out and look at any time, and if they want to say like, oh, what's our work from home policy, and they can go out and look at that and they can see it, where they don't have to feel like they are threatened because they have to come ask you for the policy. They can just find it for themselves and they can answer their question, or if it doesn't answer their question, then they can come to you and they can do that. So make sure any policies that you do set are available to them, and that you're making all your team members aware of what those policies are and where they are. All right, we talked about scorecards as we were talking about the hiring and recruiting process and setting the clear expectations for the role and defining each position. But now I want to go a little deeper into scorecards and how you use them for performance management. So I recommend that for every position that you have in the company, that you create a scorecard or a key results area document, some sort of template that you are using to track if someone is doing their job and if they're doing it well, if they're meeting the expectations of the job. It's very common for you to hire team members into a role, and you tell them that their job is to manage the scheduling, and that's the only direction that they've been given. And so it's very difficult as then a manager to say whether or not they're doing their job well or not, because there is all you've said is, hey, you're doing scheduling. So what is it that would tell them that they are doing that well? Is it that jobs, 90% of jobs finish on schedule? Is it that everyone knows, gets their schedule 2 days in advance to know where to go? What is it that you are expecting of them and would tell them that they're doing their job well? So you want to make sure that you set outcomes that you are expecting for the position. So it's important not to just set tasks and responsibilities that they do within their job, but what are the results that you're expecting? What are the outcomes that you're expecting? Make sure that those outcomes are measurable as much as possible. You want to make sure that you have something that's measurable. So it's very black and white if it's getting done or if it's not getting done. So I've got an example here that we can look at. So this is for a marketing assistant example, and we're using Bootcamp as our example company. And so one of the outcomes on the scorecard is to grow Bootcamp social following by 20% annually. So this is a very clear outcome that we are expecting that is measurable. The growing social following by 20% annually is very measurable. You can start at the beginning of the year, how many followers do we have across our social platforms? You get to the end of the year, how many followers do we have in our social platforms? Very easy to measure, right? And you can measure obviously progress throughout the year as well. So you can see where you're at the end of month 1, month 2, month 3. So it's very measurable. And then there's additional details in here that say this is how you're going to do it. So these are less measurable in that they may not be as black and white, but they are clear in saying that, hey, we're expecting that you're posting relevant articles and information to Bootcamp's social accounts. Maintain blogging consistency and posting link backs, at least 2 blogs per month. Post picture stories documenting the bootcamp culture, activities, events, birthdays, and then manage social advertising to boost social following. So some of these are measurable. You can look and say, yes, you are posting 2 blogs per month. But some of these are, manage social advertising to boost social following. That is just part of the job. You need to manage the advertising that you're doing, how we're spending our ad dollars on social, but the outcome is still growing our social following by 20%. And then your scorecard, we use a scorecard of 1 to 5 as our scoring metrics. And so the other important side of this is to say, hey, we've got the outcome that we're expecting of growing the social following by 20% annually, but what is my score if I don't hit 20%? Is it just 0? So is it a 5 or a 0? Or if I hit 18%, hey, I got really close. What does that look like? So you need to set the metrics for how do you achieve a score of 5 for this outcome? How do you achieve a score of 4, 3, 2, 1? So in this example, we're saying that, hey, if you grow by 20% or higher, which is the expectation, then you score a 5. If you grow by 15 to 20%, then you're going to score a 4. If it's 10 to 15%, you're going to score a 3, 5 to 10%, a 2, and then if you are under the 5%, then you're going to score a 1. So it's very clear. If I am sitting down each quarter and I am talking about my marketing assistant's performance, I can look at this scorecard, I can look at these metrics, and I can say, hey, you only scored a 2 on this because we haven't grown our social media following more than 10%. What can we do to get us there? This is your job, is to grow our social media following. How do we do that? And so you are setting very clear expectations in the scorecard, and then you are using this scorecard to make sure that you are sitting down formally, quarterly, every 6 months, at minimum do it annually, but make sure that you are using this to sit down and evaluate performance with your team. I highly recommend that you are doing regular touch points with your team. Weekly one-on-ones is a good example. You don't necessarily have to pull the scorecard out with every one-on-one, but you know what their requirements are. So when you're doing those weekly touch points, you can say, hey, have we gotten that blog posted for this month yet? Hey, have we done this? Hey, have we done that? You can be touching base on things that are part of their job in that weekly one-on-one. And then on a quarterly basis, you can pull out the scorecard and you can review that formally. And you can look through it and say, hey, yeah, we're doing really good in this outcome. Your score, this is just an example of one outcome. Your scorecard is going to have multiple outcomes that you're expecting for the role. And you can go through each of those with the team member and talk about where they're hitting the mark and then where they're maybe needing to make some improvements. So highly recommend setting clear expectations and then making sure you're communicating on a regular basis, but then formally evaluating their performance on at least quarterly or 6-month basis. I highly recommend you do it more than annually, but that should be your minimum, because annually, that's a whole 12 months that they either were or weren't performing and they didn't know about it. So the more often you can do it, the better, but obviously as you are managing performance, you've got to get them time to be able to make adjustments to their performance if they aren't hitting the mark and they need to make changes. All right, to reiterate a few of the performance management points that I made, we talked about providing feedback regularly. One thing that I will recommend, we talked about the weekly one-on-ones, but make sure that if there's something that you need someone to address immediately, if you notice that somebody did something wrong, don't wait until your next meeting with them or your next performance management meeting with them to go over that. Make sure you address it right away. Say, hey, I noticed that this got done incorrectly. Here's how it needs to be done moving forward. And then they can move on and do it right. If you don't address it right away, then they might do it 5 times wrong before you have that meeting with them to go over what they did wrong. So Address things quickly as you are coming across them, especially with new team members and as they're getting up and running and being trained. They want feedback. People want feedback. They want to know what they need to do, how they can do things better. So make sure that you're addressing things as you go. It's much easier than coming at it later in the formal review process and then them feeling like, well, nobody told me I was doing it wrong. So make sure addressing immediate correction when it's needed. And then we talked about quarterly scorecard reviews with your managers. And then something we can hopefully you won't have to implement often, but as a performance improvement plan. This is more of a formalized performance plan for someone that is not meeting expectations. They're not hitting the mark, and you need to put them on a formal plan to get them to performance standards or to help them to find something else. So performance improvement plan is going to be something that you'll want to put together maybe with the help of your HR person, to say, hey, this is what we need to see happen over the next 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever makes sense for your business. This is what we need to see happen in order for you to stay in your job. Otherwise, this is not the right fit for you because it's just not working out. So a performance improvement plan, you'll hear it called a PIP sometimes. Just make sure that you've got a process in place for how you would want to handle that if you do have someone that's not meeting expectations and they're consistently not meeting expectations and they just really haven't done anything to get to that point where they are meeting those expectations. All right, shifting over now to culture. Culture is who you are as a business. And culture exists in your business whether you like it or not, whether you're intentional or not, it's there. So you want to make sure that as a business owner that you are intentional about the culture that you want to build, so that your culture, the culture that's being developed, is a culture you want and not a culture that you don't. The way that you can build and continue to develop your culture is first to develop your core values. Core values exist in your business whether you've defined them or not. The core values are essentially the laws by which you live within your business. How do you operate? What do you believe in? What do you stand for? And you need to, as a business owner and as a leadership team, as a company, you need to define what those core values are. Are your core values, do you have a core value of work hard, play hard? Do you expect that your team, they work really hard and they might work long hours, but you also have a lot of fun together? Do you have a core value of help first? You are going to go above and beyond to help your customer, help your neighbor, help your fellow man, and you will figure out later how that fits into making money for your business. What is your culture? What do you want to develop, and what are your core values that you're living by? The next thing that you want to do is, once you've defined those core values, once you've said, hey, these are our core values, this is what we stand for, then you want to hire, train, and fire based on your core values. When you are hiring your team, you want to present your core values to potential team members. You want to help them see your story. You want them to live and breathe who you are. So you want to make sure that they know, hey, this is our expectation for those people that work with us, that choose to work with us. This is our expectation. This is how we live. And if this isn't you, that's okay, because not everybody's core values align with your team members' core value, your potential team members' core values. That's okay. It doesn't mean that theirs are wrong or yours are wrong. It just means that they don't align. So make sure that you are very clear about your core values in the hiring process, and that you are discussing core values with each potential team member. Then when you bring your team members on, that needs to be part of the training process, part of the onboarding process, is to really reminding and living and breathing those core values, so that they see that, hey, we're really serious about this. This is really who we are. We don't just say it. It's not just a sign on the wall. It's really who we are. And then finally, you need to fire based on your core values. If you find that you have team members that are not living your core values, regardless of whether they're doing a good job, regardless of whether they're delivering on their outcomes for their role, if they aren't living their core value, the core values of your company, they aren't the right fit for you. And you need to make sure that you are addressing that, and that you are finding a new place for them, a new home that is not your company, Because if you are allowing team members to stay on your team that are not living your core values, your culture is going to shift, and it's going to shift in a direction that you don't want it to. So you need to make sure you are hiring, you are training, and you are firing based on the core values that you have set. And then finally, you need to live your culture. You as the business owner, it's a top-down approach. If you as the business owner are not living your culture, then it doesn't really exist. You can't expect to have team members that are living your core values if you are not living your core values. You need to be your culture. You are your culture. As you build a business, you are your culture. And you need to make sure that you are aware of that and that you are constantly living your core values and you are living your culture. Build a business where you want to be and the right people will follow. So if you're building your business based on a culture that you want, then you will bring team members on to your team that want to be a part of that culture. So you need to make sure that you are very intentional about your culture. You are very intentional about the team members that you bring on, and that you are you're constantly monitoring your culture and making sure that, hey, are we still who we want to be? Are we still who I want to be? And making sure that if you are not, that you're addressing why that is. Are there team members that are infiltrating the culture that are changing it because they don't live your core values? Have you just kind of strayed away from certain core values that used to be important to you, and you've just realized that, hey, we're just not being intentional about that anymore. We need to go and fix that. Make sure that you keep your finger to the pulse and that you are really keeping tabs on your culture, because it can very quickly shift when you're not looking, and you want to make sure that you are building a business where people want to be. All right, our final topic related to people is payroll. Payroll is critical in your business because it is the process of getting your people paid. And while you can hire great team members and they maybe feel like they're part of your family and they're awesome, they want to get paid. So they are not doing this for free. They are not doing this for charity. They do want to make sure that they are getting paid for the services that they are providing. And payroll can get a little bit tricky. It can be complex. And so, payroll can be sold as being something that's relatively simple to manage by payroll companies that are trying to sell you on the ease of their service if you were to sign on with them. But there's just a lot to know about payroll so that you know what's happening behind the scenes, even if you are hiring a payroll company to handle it. So I'm going to talk about payroll, the taxes and compliance. You need to make sure, as this goes into the actual processing of payroll, but then also thinking through your cost as well. So you need to make sure that you understand that for every employee that you hire, you will be paying, as an employer, you will be paying Social Security and Medicare tax for them. You will be paying unemployment tax for them. You will be responsible for withholding their federal income tax, their state income tax, and then remitting that to the state and the federal government. So in addition to making sure you manage those taxes and withholdings and all of those filings, you need to be keeping in mind that that cost exists. So when you hire somebody for $20 an hour, they don't cost you $20 an hour. They cost you $25 an hour or $26 an hour because you have those additional costs in there. So taxes and compliance is where it can get really tricky. This is where it's very beneficial to hire a payroll company to make sure to handle that for you. And they will calculate what needs to be withheld, and then they will, remit and file the appropriate payments, but then also the filings that you're required to send each quarter or month, depending on the agency that you're reporting to. Something I will caution you on, though, is while payroll companies will say that they are responsible for that on your behalf, one, you are still ultimately responsible. And the IRS is very clear about that if you are with a payroll company that is supposed to be paying on your behalf, which, by the way, they typically are withholding the money from your account and then they go and remit it to the government. If they do not, you are still responsible ultimately. So just something to know. There's lots of reputable payroll companies out there, but there's lots of non-reputable payroll companies out there. So something to make sure you are aware of. Also, what we have seen historically as issues that we've seen with payroll companies is that if you enter a new state and you have a requirement to set up a new account or you need to get registered in that state, They typically do not do a very good job of helping you, one, to know that you need to do that, or two, to help you get registered in that state. And if you do not get registered in that state and don't get them the new account number or get them the information, they will push back and say they're not liable for that because you did not do what you needed to do on the front end. So you need to make sure that, if you hire somebody in a new state, and you onboard them in the system with whatever payroll system you choose, you onboard them in the system, you will not necessarily be triggered to set up your new state requirements. Your payroll company may just start taxing them in the same state that everyone else is in. But if you know you've hired somebody in another state and they are working in that other state, you need to know that you need to be registering for that state for the proper taxes, and that you need to get them set up in the payroll system that way. So payroll companies are great. I highly recommend that you use a payroll company to process your payroll. Don't try to do it on your own, but just know the limitations and know that they don't necessarily hold your hand through the whole process. So you need to be aware that when you hire someone in a new state, you need to be asking questions. Something else to consider on payroll is your pay periods. I highly recommend you consider biweekly or semi-monthly. Give yourself time for processing payroll. There's, more and more talk these days, or, payroll companies will say, hey, we'll do daily payroll, we'll do weekly payroll. And that's fine for certain industries, and that might make sense, but it's honestly an administrative nightmare. The more often you do payroll, the more of a nightmare it is. So I highly recommend, it's very standard to pay every other week. I highly recommend that you consider that. You might also want to consider a semi-monthly payroll, which means you're paying 2 times per month. This especially works well if you've got salaried employees and you're not having to track hours, although you can make it work with hourly employees as well. But this is really helpful, especially if you're in a business where you have monthly revenue, so you have pretty well fixed monthly revenue or certain services that are happening on a monthly basis. Because if you pay then twice per month, then you are aligning your costs with your revenue. So it's really helpful if you can do that. It also helps with cash flow management because if you pay every other week, you have that gotcha month twice a year. So you have that 3 payroll month twice a year. If you pay twice a month, you're paying a little bit more each payroll, but it's the same every single month that you're paying because you have 2 paychecks per month. So I would consider biweekly or semi-monthly. I would highly recommend that you stay away from weekly if possible. But yet I rarely see anybody just pay monthly. So most employees are probably not going to love that, although there are some companies out there that do that. So think about what pay periods make sense for your business, and think about, if you do want to align your costs better, you might want to think about that semi-monthly option. And then payroll processing. So again, I said use a payroll company, and when I say payroll company, that may just be a payroll platform that you're using, a software system that you're using. Don't try to manually calculate payroll. Don't try to do it yourself. But also don't rely too heavily on your payroll system. So you've got to know that if it seems reasonable, right? So if you are entering hours in for an employee and every week they normally get paid $1,000, or you're paying biweekly, they get paid $3,000, whatever that number is, and you go to run payroll and you realize they're getting $30,000 this payroll, you need to make sure that you're not just assuming, oh, well, the payroll, system knows what they're doing. Like, you need to be looking at that because that's not reasonable. Make sure that you're tying out, your source to the actual payroll that's happening. So if you've got timesheets, and make sure that you are tracking, okay, yes, I've got 10 timesheets here, it equaled 400 hours total, so I'm going to go and make sure that that's what we're paying out in the payroll system. Don't rely too heavily on your system. You need to know what's going on, and you need to know how things are supposed to be calculated and how things are supposed to be happening. Make sure you choose a system that streamlines your processes. So again, as you're selecting systems, I recommend you try to come up with a payroll system that can also act as your HRIS system. That allows you to streamline the onboarding process for new team members. It allows you to communicate with your team easily through the payroll platform. You can put policies out on your payroll platform. If you go with the right platform, then you have a lot of tools available to you from an HR perspective as well. So something to consider as you're thinking about your options for your payroll systems. And then make sure you're reviewing and reconciling payroll on a regular basis. So whether it's a monthly basis or whether, I recommend you reconcile each payroll, you're reconciling payroll data. But things like your benefits, you want to make sure that you are looking at your benefits bill that you pay each month and comparing it to what you're deducting from your employees each month, and making sure that it aligns and that you don't have someone showing up on your benefits bill that hasn't been employed for 2 months, or if you have a new person and they should have started benefits 3 months ago and they're still not showing up on the benefits bill, that reconciliation will help you to see that. So make sure you're reviewing your payroll for reasonableness, that it makes sense to you, but then also you're reconciling to your various source documents and source information on a regular basis. That just helps to make sure that you don't get to the end of the year, an employee comes back to you and says, I was supposed to get a pay raise on January 1st, and I'm just realizing that never took place, and now you owe me $5,000 or whatever it is. Most people are not going to let that happen because they're going to be looking for that pay raise in their paycheck, but it can happen. So make sure that you are reviewing and reconciling your payroll, making sure you're checking on any of those changes or things that should be happening, so that you don't get surprised with them later on. So payroll, critical for, people not getting paid is one of the biggest factors to an employee getting a bad taste in their mouth for an employer and it never going away. So if you just happen to have an error and everybody just didn't get paid one day, that could be a very significant problem for you long term. So you want to make sure you stay on top of your payroll, your processing, and make sure that you've really got a good process in place for handling that. All right, for Bootcamp, our example company, we have, as we've gone through the people section and we're working that out with the company, we are deciding that we are going to primarily be hiring trainers. That will be the majority of the team members that we hire, as well as developers for building our platform. So those will be the two primary employee types that we will need. So we're going to develop scorecards and job descriptions specifically for those positions, because those we will be hiring those multiple times and multiple people in the same role. We are going to track time to programs. So each of our trainers is going to track their time specifically to the programs that are developed. So again, we decided in our accounting section that we're going to be tracking our profitability by each program. So we'll be tracking revenue coming in by program, but then we want to make sure we're tracking time by program so that we can allocate the cost appropriately to each of those programs. We're implementing scorecards and a quarterly scorecard review. So we've put together the scorecards for each of the positions that we have, and then we'll be doing a quarterly scorecard review. And then we've decided that biweekly payroll makes sense for us. So we are going to process payroll on a biweekly basis because most of our team members are hourly, and hourly does tend to work a little bit better with a biweekly pay period than the semi-monthly does. So we are going to be doing biweekly payroll and using our time tracking to pull the data for payroll and to process it that way. Right, homework for this week, there's a lot. We've got your people worksheet that you'll work through, which will take you through these homework pieces that we're going to have. You want to set up your interviewing and onboarding process and templates. So, set up how many interviews are you going to have? What does that schedule look like? Set up your application questions, set up your scorecards and your job descriptions for that. You'll set up your scorecards for each position. So again, that's part of kind of you're developing that position, but then also part of your performance management. And then implement your payroll system and schedule. So again, if you're a brand new business, you're getting payroll set up. But if you already are in existence, just make sure that you have a good payroll system. Consider whether you need to maybe switch your payroll system so that you have better ability to manage the onboarding process and streamline the payroll process for you. And then just make sure that you've got your schedule in place and that you've got your process in place for how you're handling payroll. And next week is week 6. So we will be finishing up the 6-week program with sales and marketing next week. So we're going to cover how do you launch your product? How do you get customers in for your product? And what are some things to consider for a new business as you're launching or as you're growing a business with your sales and marketing?